The oral SERD field is expanding. As targeted protein degradation gains momentum, oral selective estrogen receptor degraders are emerging as one of its most advanced proving grounds. We'll discuss the landscape for oral SERDs on this week's BioCentury This Week podcast, and we'll check in on the U.S. regulatory environment in the wake of a refusal to file for a Moderna vaccine by FDA and a setback at FDA for an accelerated approval for an orphan drug from Disc Medicine. I'm Jeff Cranmer, host of the BioCentury This Week podcast and executive editor here at BioCentury. And today I'm joined by podcast regulars Steve Usden, who is our longtime Washington editor, and Lauren Martz, who heads up all of our product development coverage. But first, we're excited here at BioCentury to introduce a new exclusive opportunity for our subscribers. It's launching at the BioCentury Bay Helix East-West Summit in Seoul in a matter of a few weeks. You'll be able to step inside the BioCentury Lounge, a dedicated space designed to connect, recharge, and inspire conversation among industry leaders. You can experience unique networking moments, insider insights, and a place to unwind between sessions. Don't wait, check out more at biocenturylounge.com. And if you haven't registered yet, join us in Seoul. It's going to be a great chance to check out the Korean biotech ecosystem. And we will have investors from around the globe. We'll have biotechs from China. We'll have investors from Singapore. We'll have a lot of investors from Japan on a panel that I'll be moderating on the Japanese biotech ecosystem. So,
Jeff, I just have to say that lounge sounds so cool. Are you going to have lounge music? Are people going to be wearing lounge wear?
I really hope I'm going to wear loungewear. I think that sounds really, really awesome, Steve. And I'm also hoping that they're going to have some massage chairs and maybe some delicious Korean food like some mandu or perhaps a little kimchi treats of some sort. I don't know, Steve. Why don't you join us this time around?
I would love to. I would go all the way to Korea for a lounge.
It's going to be good. And late night, I'm told we'll be doing some norabang, which is the Korean answer to Japan's karaoke craze. And I'm sure it will be a soju-fueled experience. I'm going to be practicing all my Ringo Starr songs. That's kind of my wheelhouse there. All right, let's get to it. Next generation estrogen receptor degraders, SERDs, aim to differentiate on depth of pathway suppression modality and which treatment settings they can own. Lindsay Martin did a deep dive, one of our new analysis decks that are really cool. And Lauren, you edited the piece. You've been following the space for ages now. What's new?
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, Lindsay did a great job on this very comprehensive deck of what's happening in the oral SERD space. One of the things that triggered this at this time is that it's a very catalyst-rich year for oral SERDs. The one that everyone is talking about is the June PDUFA date for Arvinas's vepdegestrant, which is not only a milestone in this SERD, estrogen receptor degrader space, but also for PROTACs and those sort of rationally designed targeted protein degraders in general. This could be the first approval for this entire subset of modality. In addition to that, I think she has at least 5 clinical readouts this year with some really interesting and important ones. So Roche's giredestrant is up for potential approval this year. I think they're looking at a fourth quarter timeline, though we don't know too much about the regulatory submission, and a few other clinical milestones. So as you mentioned, we've been following this space for a long time. I think it's getting so much attention because this is such a big and chronic breast cancer indication. So you're talking about patients who have estrogen receptor positive. In most cases, these are most effective for estrogen receptor mutant. So, mutations that emerge when you've treated this with other endocrine therapies, and HER2 negative. So you're talking about like 70% of all breast cancers. And this is part of a backbone type therapy that could be used for a long time. So it's a huge potential market. And the existing options, there's room to improve. Fulvestrant's been on the market for a long time. It's an intramuscular injection that can be painful, that doesn't address brain metastases because it doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. So there's been a lot of work to improve this modality.
Lauren, how does this compare with other ways to target the estrogen receptor?
Yeah, so compared with fulvestrant, as I mentioned, it crosses the blood-brain barrier. And then when you look at the different strategies of targeting estrogen receptor, even within this group that we've talked about, the benefit of a degrader versus something that targets estrogen downstream is that, or that just targets the receptor through a different mechanism, is that you're actually blocking potentially all signaling through this receptor. So you're knocking out the receptor. In most cases, not completely, but then a lot of these oral SERDs have sort of a secondary antagonistic activity on the receptor that it remains as well. So the idea is that you're getting a more complete blockade of this pathway. I think that the main difference between these oral SERDs and the Protacs, like Arvinas' product that we talked about, are how the degradation happens. So Protac is designed, it's sort of a modular design where you're directly labeling the receptor for degradation by linking it to an E3 ligase, for example. With the oral SERDs, it's more of an indirect mechanism that destabilizes the receptor. So the result is, I think as you mentioned at the beginning, it may be a different level of knockdown that you're getting. But again, that secondary antagonism maybe makes up for the difference there. In clinical data, we haven't seen a big difference across these slightly different variations of how you degrade the receptor. I don't think there's necessarily a huge benefit to what you would get from Arvinas' product, for example, in the second line setting where that's up for approval.
And of course, Arvinas is partnered with Pfizer on that program. What other strategies are out there? How are people kind of rising above the noise, Lauren, given that it's such a crowded space?
Yeah, so it's a crowded space, but again, it's a really big potential space. But the first approvals that we've seen in this sort of next generation oral SERD landscape are from Lilly and Menarini. In both cases, those are second line approvals in patients who have mutations in the estrogen receptor. So most of the clinical activity that is happening right now in the pipeline is for this second line indication. In addition to, how fully these different therapies are degrading the receptor or blocking the receptor's function, there's also some differentiation in sort of the where in the treatment, the course of treatment, different companies are taking their programs. As I mentioned, most is in the second line. There are a few programs that are looking at first line and even adjuvant settings. And I think that's where you see the biggest impact of these next generation therapies sort of appearing at this time. We mentioned Roche's giredestrant program, which had positive data in the adjuvant and first line setting as well. So that's sort of the out in front in the earlier lines. AstraZeneca's camizestrant also is expecting data second half this year as a first line therapy. Olema has a first line therapy program as well. I think sort of trying to find the best place and the least crowded place to use some of these mechanisms will also emerge as a differentiation strategy for the growing number of companies that are working within this space.
All right, and they're looking to, for starters, looking to best the two oral SERDs that are on the market now, right? And these were years in the making. There's a product from Menarini Group, got approval in 2023. That's SERDU. And then Lilly followed up a couple of years later with its product approved in 2025. How do you say that one, Lauren? Inlurio, I think.
Inlurio is, I think, how you say it.
I'm gonna go there. I'm trying to get better with the pronunciations of these complicated drug names, but important products. And so we've got 11 assets in the pipeline. What are there anything in particular you're watching out for, Lauren, as you handicap this space?
So I'm watching for, as data continue to emerge, I'm watching for efficacy against brain metastases, which again is something that I think there's a potential to differentiate there. And it's a really important application for breast cancer. So I know that we'll see some data, I think it's in the fourth quarter for SERD from NR80, as you mentioned. And finding out those little places where we may see benefits from different programs and how this all lays out will be interesting.
Sounds good. And yep, 2026, as I believe Lauren said, we could get that first PROTAC to gain approval in any disease. And that's the Arvinas Pfizer product. Well, Lauren, thanks much for the update. We'll take a quick break and we'll go to Washington to get an update from Steve.
BioCentury This Week is brought to you by the 5th East-West Biopharma Summit in South Korea. An arc of innovation is emerging across Asia, and Western biopharma leaders are taking note, from cross-border deals to new COs. In March 2026, the 5th BioCentury Bay Helix East-West Biopharma Summit visits South Korea for the first time. Meet the biopharma leaders putting Korea innovation on the global map. Learn why Korea has become a clinical trial and manufacturing hub. Discover if Korea is the next hotspot for new co-formation. Plus meet biopharma innovators from India to Singapore to China and Japan. Register now at biocenturyeastwest.com.
All right, we're back. I'm actually on the road today, Steve. And as we record this, like my screen is lighting up with flash flood warnings, and I believe we got snow in the mountains around LA, which is always a little trippy for me. Just all those songs about it never raining in Southern California. But maybe this helps set the stage for what you want to talk about, Steve. We had the Moderna refusal to file. Obviously, that is pretty big news. It comes against this backdrop of HHS Secretary RFK Jr.'s assault on vaccines. I don't know what to call it really, but he is dramatically shaking things up. And then we had this disc setback, Steve. What's happening at FDA?
Yeah, so last week, as you mentioned, FDA refused to accept Moderna's application for a flu vaccine. It was an extraordinary decision. It was taken by CBER Director Vinay Prasad. We can get into the details, but basically, he came up with an excuse for not accepting the application and for overriding the recommendations of CBER staff. It's clear that FDA Commissioner Marty Makary and especially HHS Secretary Kennedy are determined to sharply reduce access to vaccines, eliminate mRNA-based vaccines if they can, and stop forward progress in developing new vaccines. There could be reasons to question whether Moderna used the best comparator in its trial, but that's the kind of thing that's typically adjudicated in a review, and preferably with input from an advisory committee. It's difficult to give FDA the benefit of the doubt here, given HHS Secretary Kennedy's false assertions that mRNA vaccines are inherently dangerous, and his remark last week that he isn't afraid of germs because he snorted cocaine off of a toilet seat.
Who among us, Steve?
What?
I said, who among us has it? Anyway, it's yes, and that jives with his comments about if all the skeletons in his closet could vote, he'd be king of the universe. But yes,
but the thing is, it's one thing to have skeletons in your closet. It's another thing to boast of them and to make statements as the health secretary that suggest that germs aren't something to be afraid of and that cocaine snorting is something to be proud of. Look, the action against Moderna makes the U.S. vulnerable, not just to seasonal influenza, which this vaccine is intended to protect against, but also to pandemic influenza. Because when, not if, there's an influenza pandemic, the world will need mRNA vaccines to avoid catastrophic loss of life. This is especially true if there's an avian influenza pandemic, because traditional egg-based manufacturing won't be able to meet demand. Chickens may be culled, reducing egg supplies. It may not be possible to produce avian influenza virus at scale in chicken eggs, and it certainly won't be able to do it as fast as you can do do it in mRNA-based vaccines. So creating this tremendous disincentive for forward motion in mRNA vaccine development, particularly for influenza, is really inviting a public health disaster.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
And
It's
so you mentioned also Disc Medicine, right? So last week, FDA issued a complete response letter to Disc Medicine for a therapy to treat a very rare disease that has no effective treatment. It looked like the company was on track for approval before it got the CRL. It even received a Commissioner National Priority Voucher from Commissioner McCary. The CRL was based on skepticism about the clinical relevance of a biomarker. And this is one of a string of setbacks based on FDA's refusal to accept a biomarker for accelerated approval, most of them in rare diseases. Vinay Prasad was heavily involved in this decision, even though it was a CDER decision, not a CBER decision. Remember, he's also the chief science officer and the chief medical officer for FDA. So FDA staff told me that Prasad was involved with this decision also. It may come out okay in the end for DISC. DISC will have clinical data later this year, so its drug may be approved on that clinical data. But the CRL is increasing concerns that FDA is upending the paradigm for orphan drug development, which is really based around getting accelerated approval on the basis of biomarkers.
And it sort of seems to kind of go at odds with some of the things we're hearing out of FDA leadership, that they want to speed development of drugs that, help orphan diseases. Isn't that the case, Steve?
Well, they certainly are saying that. Vinay Prasad has said it. Marty McCary has said it. They've talked about it in the context of N of 1 therapies, but they've said it more broadly as well. Look, there's just a discordance between their words and their actions when it comes to accelerated approval for drugs to treat orphan diseases. And that's a good segue to a commentary that I wrote last week, which seems to have resonated with people. I've gotten a lot of comments back about it. And in the commentary, I say basically that it is past time for the leadership of the life sciences industry, particularly for the CEOs of the largest multinational pharmaceutical companies, to demand that Vinay Prasad exit FDA expeditiously.
Well, Steve, we've worked together 20 years. You've been following FDA for at least 30 years now, and I don't recall you ever making such a dramatic call. What are your reasons?
What we just talked about, what's happened with Moderna and more broadly with vaccine policy is one thing. Another is Prasad's management style. He's had at least one that I know of, sexual harassment complaint filed against him from an FDA staffer, and another who's filed another complaint against him for abusive language and the way that he deals with the staff there. He put out this memo that we reported on a few months ago where he said that basically anybody at FDA who doesn't agree with him should just resign, and there were no consequences to him for that. There are people who think, oh, well, this is just about vaccines. First of all, of course, there's nothing just about vaccines. They're the most important public health protection that we have. But it's not going to be limited to vaccines. It's not going to be limited to Disc Medicine. You can look at what happened to Unicure. It's a small biotech company that is developing a gene therapy for Huntington's disease, another terrible, terrible disease that has no effective therapies. FDA, Prasad, moved the goalpost for approval of that gene therapy, which was a gut punch to patients with that disease and to their families. I could go on, but
so importantly, you also said that he's overriding staff scientists as well. Like, is it common for someone of his level to get down into the weeds of decision making by his staff?
Well, it's not common, okay, but it's not unprecedented. CBER directors, CDER directors, Peter Marks when he was at CBER, Janet Woodcock when she was running CDER, occasionally, in very rare instances, did do that. It was highly controversial when they did it, and they laid out their reasoning for it publicly. They discussed it publicly. Now it's become almost routine. What people at FDA tell me is that Prasad is involving himself in basically all of CBER's approval decisions, and he's involving himself in CDER decision making. He's conducting his own analyses, and in many cases, the analyses that he's conducting are at odds with the analyses that experienced FDA staff have made. So it's not unprecedented, but the scope of it is unprecedented, and it's having detrimental effects on morale at FDA, and it's making FDA regulatory decisions far more unpredictable.
Now, when RFK Jr. was up for approval, it seemed as though CEOs of biopharmas kind of looked the other way. They've now gone on to, or at least held their nose. I don't know what the right term is, but and now they've gone on to strike MFN deals with the Trump administration. Where do things stand for those? Are they likely to, you wrote that these CEOs are privately furious, and yet crickets. I haven't heard anyone speak out.
Well, there have been some comments about vaccine policy. Albert Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer, has said that he's disagreed strongly with the decisions that FDA has made about vaccines. The trade associations have also spoken out about vaccines, but they haven't spoken out, nearly as strongly as I believe that they should have. I think that they're sitting back and hoping that things kind of sort themselves out without them.
And you got into some of this in your conversation with Peter Kolchinsky of RA Capital on our sister podcast, which we're actually releasing earlier than we normally would, given how quickly things are moving. Do you want to touch on some of Peter's comments?
So that was a really interesting interview. I think anybody that listens to it's going to be kind of on the edge of their seat. He's far more passionate and interesting than I am on these topics. He talked about a lot of things. He talked about why he's advising companies in RA's portfolio to conduct early stage trials outside of the United States if they can. He talked about his concerns about the effect of public policy in the United States on innovation. The most favored nation discussions are bargains that have been made between companies and the administration, the IRA's pill penalty, and other things. And then he also talked in very personal terms about why he is such a strong advocate on some issues that some people in the industry think are not central, not core to what a life sciences leader should be talking about. Particularly talked about immigration. He said he's an immigrant, and the whole industry is fueled by the brains and motivation of immigrants. And that's one of the things that's led him to speak out very strongly to oppose anti-immigration policies and actions of the current administration.
All right. Well, you'll be able to check out Steve's conversation with Peter on our YouTube channel, or, of course, wherever you get your podcast. Steve will be, writing a story about it as well. And Steve's story on DISC and his commentary also available at biocentury.com, biocenturypodcast.com. Steve, final word. What are you expecting in the near term?
More chaos, more change. There's been some movement of some senior staffers from FDA who have been given joint appointments at HHS last week. I think that that's intended to try to quell some of the turbulence at FDA. I'm not sure how well that's going to work. And I think that we're going to see a shift in FDA and the administration's messaging about some of these issues in the run-up to the midterm elections. I wrote a story last week about a memo that one of the leaders of the MAHA movement sent to congressional Republicans, telling them that it doesn't really poll well to come out overtly against vaccines as a whole, and then basically suggesting what I consider to be a somewhat insidious strategy, and saying that they should promote medical freedom, which is a way to try to erode the childhood vaccine schedule, and also to try to remove liability protections from vaccine manufacturers, which would make it difficult, if not impossible, for companies to continue to market certain vaccines in the United States. So I think you're going to see that. And you're also going to see a shift and a lot more energy put into messaging around food issues, because those seem to pull even, much higher than the vaccine issues with the MAHA supporters.
Yeah, and this is as measles outbreaks are mounting in the U.S. So you've got to believe that the pendulum will swing back at some point. But Steve, something that you had said last week was, that aside, it's also about the vaccines, the programs that aren't going to get done in this environment.
Yeah, that's right. That's why I think that it's really important to push for science-based, independent regulatory system in the United States to basically to regain that credibility and the ability to incentivize the development of medicines that are going to benefit patients in the United States and around the world.
All right, we'll leave it there. If you like what you're hearing, subscribe to our podcast. Leave us a comment. We'd love to hear from you. Kendall Square Orchestra provides the music for BioCentury this week and the BioCentury show. Thanks for tuning in. We will catch you next week.